Hello, and welcome to yet another episode of the Back to the TARDIS podcast, the podcast where we take a look at every single episode of the 2005 revival of BBC's Doctor Who. I'm Jeff.
I am Skylar.
And I'm Virgil.
And this week we are discussing Series 5, Episodes 8 and 9, The Hungry Earth and Cold Blood, by future showrunner and frequent object of my ire, Chris Chibnall. This features the new series return of yet another classic monster, this time the Silurians. I have to say, I think all of us are in agreement that this is far and away better than most of his other Doctor Who writing pedigree. Like, it's still kind of mid, but like,
It's high mid.
Yeah, it's high mid.
yeah, definitely. It's kind of like every time I watch it, it's like, yeah, it's good, but considering the quality of the like mid to late season fucking two-parters that we were getting in the RTD era, it's like, man. Anyways, we start off in the south of Wales in 2020 in something that has only become more ironic in the past year.
Yeah, I forgot this took place in 2020.
Yeah, I was like, hey, it's the modern day, and then I do think it's very funny how whenever they do near future episodes, they like purposefully don't show any technology because
Yeah.
they have no idea what's going to be going on.
Yeah. Anyways, there is I will say something that I do like about this episode is one of the things it like sets up here at the very beginning with the thing of like the future Amy and the future Rory waving to the Doctor is like how it sets you up so you think like, oh, obviously like nobody was going to die anyways, but like it's even more like, oh yeah, everyone's completely safe this time no matter how much we like fake it out because we've already seen them in the future. And then at the very end they're like, psych.
Yeah, that's a very good device. It felt that despite this is probably going to sound sacrilegious to Jeff, but this episode and its construction and just the feel and tone of it, at least it to me it kind of felt more RTD era than Moffat, just in like the type of story and the types of themes it was going for, and small little attention to detail things like that aren't exactly like Moffat's like, oh, did you notice this? I'm so clever.
Yeah.
Whoa. Like,
Yeah.
it wasn't quite to that level, but it was still like smart when you like look back at it. I definitely agree. There are some smart choices made in this episode that we'll talk about throughout.
Yeah. This might just be the virtue of it being a two-parter and the fact that like we've only really had two Chibnall two-parters, and both of them were kind of mid and more focused on arc stuff. But like one of the nice things about this being a two-parter is Chibnall kind of gets to flex his character writing muscles a little bit more because he actually has he's correctly paced an episode and he has enough time to do it. So you're introduced to all these characters and you get kind of a little bit of a feel for them. Yeah. And then so, I mean, we're probably going to get all heading around because like, you know, this isn't human nature. We're not all super into like, ooh, fucking like the nitty gritty or whatever. But I would just like to say I find it incredibly humorous that Chibnall, despite being the lib that he is, managed to write an episode story where pretty much the entire second half of the story happens because one white woman ruins everything.
I had that. I knew one of us would make that joke. I swear. Yeah, it's just so weird and interesting, and this two-parter has kind of cemented a few ideas I've had about Chibnall in my mind. One is that, like, at some point in your career, like, generally speaking, for most creative people, it's like you can't keep to the same level of quality that you've had before. Like, sometimes, of course, it's not always the case, but yeah, that seems to be the case with Chibnall. It also seems to be the case that whenever he's writing stuff that's like, I wouldn't call 42 or like this episode unimportant. Like, they have some good like character moments and progression.
I mean,
for,
this
like,
one's
the overall arc.
very important for the rest of the season arc.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, Moffat probably, you know, had some input of like, okay, you can do this, but at the end I want this. But, like, he delivered, you know? I think it's very arguable that, like, that's where Chibnall can shine the most, whereas in a more administrative position, like, good luck, man.
Yeah, and also, like, you know, he already wrote Adrift, and he seems to not be interested in writing things as good as Adrift ever again. No, and it's like, it's kind of like, it's like, I guess they offered it to him because he did Broadchurch, but it's always kind of felt to me that he never really came off like a showrunner pick, just someone who writes decent enough like mid-season filler episodes and is a good person to have in the back pocket for like season's writing team or whatever. And admittedly, again, I haven't seen any sources for this, but I have heard some rumors that like no one else did it, so they had to ask him, as opposed to and so it's like I kind of wonder if that's the case, because like a lot of the recurring writer, like, really you only have a few options for recurring Who writers in terms of having made enough of a splash or had enough experience that the BBC would have probably approached them to hire. But like, so like Mark Gatiss was out because he's too close to Moffat and he wouldn't want to anyway. And that's fine because he would have just been Moffat light. Toby Whithouse would have been really good, but I guess he didn't want to. To a lesser extent, Jamie Matheson. So, but obviously that didn't happen, so it just kind of came down to Chibnall.
Yeah, I know we're kind of going off into a whole tangent, but it really seems to me the best way forward is to kind of get like new blood or people who like, because that was what RTD was basically. Like he had previous stuff to his name, but it wasn't like a career of Doctor Who.
The problem, like, Chibnall is getting new blood, but the problem is that aside from like Vinay Patel, they're not like, either what they're contributing isn't that spectacular, or just other parts of the show are dragging that down. Like, I think you need to even reach, like, just like take someone who like has like proven themselves on other shows but not necessarily on Who, because the way that the Who's writers like table is, like, unless you get another person like Stephen Moffat who is able to consistently deliver bangers, it's never going to work that same way as that handover did. Because, like, obviously, who's going to follow RTD next? Stephen Moffat, duh. Who's going to follow Stephen Moffat is a much harder question, because you didn't ever really have anyone like Moffat during his tenure.
Exactly. But yeah, it's so bizarre to me. Like, I could, as someone who's seen the first season of Broadchurch, I can understand the logic for picking Chibnall, even like
Yeah.
outside of the politics, outside of everything else. Like I can see it, but just the setting of Doctor Who doesn't lend itself to that, except for the companions. And unfortunately,
Well,
they seem
no,
to try
here's
to.
the thing. Here's the thing. It could. I mean, we're getting way off topic here, but one of the things that I thought about the last time that I watched The Woman Who Fell to Earth is that one of the things, like, admittedly, like, it wouldn't necessarily solve all the writing issues, but I think it might open things up for them to take a new spin on the show that would be interesting, which is, what if 13 doesn't have the TARDIS for most of the season and it becomes like a Neo version of the Third Doctor's exile on Earth? Like, change the show's dynamics up
Sure.
a little bit more, because that's the thing. Like, RTD era is pretty clearly defined. Moffat era is pretty clearly defined in the vibe it was going for. The only vibe that Chibnall era I can tell is going for is either rehashing the previous two or utter mediocrity. Or maybe
Yeah.
maybe I guess the historical focus. I guess.
Sure. And that's what I was gonna. Go ahead.
Yeah, I will point out the being grounded on Earth is something that Moffat tried, and as much as season 10 is great, it's something that they threw out there and then immediately just repeatedly
Oh
violated.
no, I don't
which
think
made...
they were intending to do something
No,
like
of
that.
course not. But
Like,
it's just
I'm
like
saying go full whole hog. The Doctor is stuck on Earth without a TARDIS and, like, confined to the British Isles for, like, most of a season. And then also don't kill Grace off in the first episode.
so true.
True.
Yeah, I think it would actually be more interesting if he wasn't confined to the British Isles. Just
Okay.
personally, like, if that
That's
were a
true.
thing. But also,
like,
we're on a massive tangent. Right now.
realistically, unless you're getting on a plane to fucking solve alien crimes, you're pretty much limited.
Are you telling me the Doctor wouldn't just Sonic an ATM and then buy a plane ticket if he heard
That's
about
true.
some cool thing happening elsewhere?
That's
This
true.
is
And then
true.
just use
But
his
yeah,
psychic paper to
keep
act as a passport?
Keep it earthbound is my thought, or like
Yeah.
do something else with the formula, because it's pretty clear that if you're not going to, like, writing wise establish any specific, like, notable hallmark about you could at least do something with the core format of the show.
Definitely. And what I was going to tie it back to the two episodes we're talking about is that the weird thing is that he does a pretty good job. Like, these aren't the best side characters ever in Who. Of course they're not. But you get a sense of where everyone is, including, like, the militant Silurian and the neo-lib white woman who ruins everything.
the white woman who ruins everything, you at least sort of get an idea for why she thought it was a good idea, even if you're like, God, you're fucking stupid.
Yeah, whereas opposed to, like, Rosa, which I'm pretty sure, I know that wasn't, like, entirely Chris Chibnall, but he has a writing credit, as opposed to that where it's just, like, future racist, and it's just this is a cardboard cutout.
I can't speak for all people of color, but I think most people of color would agree that killing Rosa Parks does not equal undoing the ending of racism. That sounds like a white man wrote it. Let's be real here.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, like, not to get too lost in the sauce, but it's just, again, it's very curious to me that, like, 42 solid side characters, not the best in the world. These two episodes, solid side characters, probably better than 42 with their side characters. Still not the best in the world, and now we're at...
Adrift.
Yes. Sorry, I was speaking mostly. Anyways.
Yeah, but I mean, like, Adrift is really, like, the biggest smoking gun of, like, he could be he could be so much better, or he could be trying so much harder than he is, and he very clearly isn't.
Yeah, so it's just, like, I can name, like, actually I can't because I'm terrible with names and I do this for mainly the podcast, but, like, these are people with personalities, whereas, like, what can I point to in series 11 or 12 that aren't pre-established characters or fan service moments? Like, Benny? That's a fucking meme.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. It's just like, yeah. And I mean, like, some people will complain that this is basically a ripoff of, like one of the older Silurian stories. I haven't seen any of those stories, so I can't speak for it. But I mean, it's definitely interesting, and I like how there's sort of like this, as much as you can get in an hour and a half episode, there's this feeling of intrigue between different forces where you have like the doctor who's trying to patch everything together, and then you have the like Silurian military commander who's intentionally basically trying to start a war, and then you have the scientist who that is one thing. If he ping pongs from like, I'm going to commit unethical experiments on these people, to no, they deserve rights, like weirdly quickly. And then you have the other head of the Silurian dude, who I believe is actually, fun fact, played by the guy who was like the original voice actor for Marvin the Paranoid Android in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy radio series.
Deep cut.
Yeah. And then the humans on top, and it's just like, you have all of these things going on. And it's just like, yeah.
And it's juggled well. At least,
Yeah.
you know, it's paced out well. The two-parter helps. The putting the dome over the small town so it looks at night looks how it is at night. I can talk. It's like a good setting both above and below ground, and it's one of the arguments, like, again, going to Chibnall's like apparent strengths in Broadchurch, it's one of those things that isn't wrapped up neatly. And like, if Doctor Who was a show that cared more about continuity, hell yeah, I'd love to see like the humans and the Silurians underground try and like build a thing together. We know they don't, or at least we haven't seen it, because there's like 5 great and bountiful human fucking empires, because we love imperialism so goddamn much. Anyways,
That was an RTD thing, though.
Yeah.
I will say, I didn't remember how this episode ended, and for a moment I was like, is this gonna be a thing? Like, is there a whole plot line like the Zygons in Moffat and 12 era that I'm just forgetting about?
Yeah.
And then it was like, oh no, he kind of puts it off. And like, yeah, that would have been fine, or it is fine. Obviously I do wish it was followed up on, like the Zygon stuff is, because that stuff is a highlight of 12's era, but oh well.
Yeah, no. And and I mean, like, the other thing that I'm thinking about is it's always hard to tell, like, how much work the showrunner is doing on the episode behind the scenes to make sure it, like, all flows and works a little bit better. But, like, I swear it's just, like, I don't know if it's just because he didn't have another showrunner to like watch over him, but even then he was pretty much the person in charge of Torchwood, and then RTD would just kind of stick his head over and be like, hey, what are you up to, man? Because like obviously RTD has his hands full with other things, and like that show wasn't perfect, but it was at least a hell of a lot better than what we've been getting.
When it was bad, it was usually bad in interesting ways.
Yeah, it at least it wasn't bad, and it wasn't like mediocre bad or just so awfully like idiotic bad. It usually, like, Sex Alien is stupid, but at least it's something different, you know?
Yeah. But I guess what my overall point is that it's like, it's impressive to me that it's like, this works as like a classic sci-fi story with allegory. This works as sort of like midpoint Doctor Who. It works as a transition point for the overall arc of the show for Rory to disappear. It's just like, it's operating on multiple levels and it's staying competent while doing it. And as you said, there's kind of a problem where we don't know how much of that is Moffat, how much of that is Chris, how much of that was collaboration, how much was Steven like actively going against Chris. Like, we can't, I mean, I guess we could look at the notes in the wiki,
punching
but
up the
really
script
don't
in
know
post
that.
or whatever.
Yeah, so it's just, you know, and I genuinely applaud him for it. It's just, it's very curious to me as like a midpoint in the series, and now knowing what we know all these years later, as a future showrunner, I don't know. It's interesting because you could look at Stephen Moffat's prior work, and it pretty much tracks exactly with how his era goes.
Yeah.
Almost one for one, and you can't really do that.
Or at least the places that it doesn't are understandable because it's still RTD show, and so there's still a bit more of the RTD show era DNA in there instead.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas this feels like an RTD script to me, like kind of, but then you have some of the Moffat like time crack isms, and then like Chibnall, I guess you could say we have his stellar like grounded side character like world building, but then that kind of just doesn't stick around later. So it's like, what is this episode?
He's the only, like, even like, I don't even think like, it's weird how like much like difference in quality. Like, I don't think I've ever seen someone in between them coming from just a general like episode writer to becoming like the head showrunner. I don't think I've ever seen someone's like quality drop that noticeably. Like, don't get me wrong, Moffat dropped quality hard, but not initially. And you could tell that, like, when he dropped quality, it was because he overextended and there was shit like Sherlock and the 50th anniversary and stuff going on. And you could tell that he kind of got a little bit too far in. And then when he stepped back out again with 12, like, he noticeably got better again. And then RTD kind of obviously maintained a consistent level of quality pretty much the entire time, except for Love and Monsters in the series 3 and 4 finales.
Yeah. I don't know. We're going all over the place, but it's like, it's genuinely not because I'm like trying to avoid talking about the actual stuff. I mean, like, as I said, like, the actual quality is
what
good.
Is there to say? It's Silurians. It's a good episode. It's a Doctor Who episode. But again, it's like, it's a good episode, but like the stuff around like the fact that it's just fine instead of either painfully mediocre or just kind of there or like awful is like, it's I'm genuinely interested in this because it's literally like, I mean, we haven't gone all the way yet. Like, I think he writes 2 episodes in series 7. He wrote the dinosaurs on the spaceship one, and he wrote the one with the cubes. And admittedly, people shit on the one with the cubes, but I think some of that actually wasn't his fault. Like, I think that one just had awful production problems. So it's like, I'm genuinely curious to see where this goes because, like, it's just like, does his quality just suddenly drop as soon as he enters the writer's chair?
Yeah, and to get a little bit more into this episode specifically, I think a lot of what makes it work, outside of just how, like, well, narratively it's constructed and the pacing, is that Matt Smith and Karen Gillan and Arthur Darvill are, like, going front and center and acting their asses off. 11 does great work when he talks with the Silurian agent they capture. Amy does a good job acting, like, tortured and afraid, which, that's a sentence. And then you get, like, the pathos with what happens to Rory. And I know some of that is, like, literally, like, how the script positions them, but I'm also wondering, like, how much is the lack of quality of the Whittaker era due to, like, her not really, like, her being instructed to, like, not look up on the show, and, like, I know it's kind of been the meme that, like, oh, the actors are good, it's just the writing, but at points like this, when I'm just, like, when we see Chris Chibnall pull out something like this, I'm kind of forced to re-examine that, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, I don't know. It's some of it I think is the writing, and maybe some of it is just, or like miscasting or whatever, but like I think Yaz could have been a really promising companion given a different writer. I think Ryan could have been an interesting companion given a different writer. And then Graham was obviously pretty like already pretty interesting, even though he just kind of dipped at the end of the last episode. But like, yeah, it's so weird. Like, it feels like a perfect storm of like bad things or like production problems are happening, because it's yeah. And part of it is just generally I wonder if because they had to ask him to do it or whatever, that he's not as enthusiastic as others were or whatever. But it's just like, I don't get half the problems that the show is having. Like, yeah, it baffles me.
Indeed.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. And I don't think we will ever know unless someone writes like a huge expose of like, here is what was going on behind the scenes on Doctor Who during this time. I don't think we're ever going to know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, it's interesting. You ever this happened to me. Do you ever like misremember and feel like, oh, Vastra's in this episode even though she isn't?
Yes.
Wait, she's not?
She's not. Vastra's not in this episode.
How does
the two things
how
I
does Vastra
misremember.
show up again? I do not remember.
The two
I
things.
think she just appears in A Good Man Goes to War.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, she says she owes a debt to the Doctor, and that's why she's there. We'll get to the problems with that sometime later. But yeah, I always either misremember that she as a character shows up here, or that the actress in Silurian makeup is here, but like,
yeah,
it's
a
different
like,
character.
It's like the fucking dude. It's like how the Silurian episode. I mean, not the Silurian episode. The Sontaran episode has like the actor who would play Strax, but it's not Strax.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah,
Man.
it's weird.
The makeup work is good, though.
You're hurting
Yeah.
my head. Oh, it's really
Oh
good.
yeah. The makeup work and the set work, especially for the Silurian lair, is really impressive. I like it a lot. It's definitely one of the standout sets for Series 5, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Very, very good stuff.
I do think, like, nitpicking wise, it could be very. There's a lot you could say about how the Doctor is just like, oh yeah, come up with a compromise, like a peace, this is how we're introducing ourselves to the world, and not like the hierarchy of like the important world leaders or the important people on the planet means a damn thing. Like, it really doesn't, but just like narratively, it's just like, so these people who are largely scientists and also people from like that town over there, like, are just gonna like statescraft. It feels, again, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't go anywhere, and the setup, like,
and
it would
I think
imply
it's mainly
other
just
stuff.
supposed to be if they're the people that are around.
Yeah, I get
and
the sense.
And it's a personal thing for them, but yeah.
Yeah, I get the sense, and again, this is a very minor nitpicking thing because I largely enjoyed this episode, but I get the sense that thematically it was kind of going for, like, the idea that, like, the normal person, like the everyday average Joe, Jane, Jax, whatever, like, can rise to greatness and do something, like, really awesome, like broker a peace deal, or could do something really horrible, like murder a prisoner of war. Yeah. So, like, that gets across kind of nominally, but it never really feels earned, except for the white lady ruining everything. But that's basically water
really
is
funny
wet.
because I was watching the episode, and the point where the granddad is like, he's like, yeah, I'm gonna have to stay down here, and she's like, it's all my fault, and he's like, no, it's not, and she's like, yeah, and I'm like, yeah, it fucking is. It absolutely is your fault. Like, come on.
He's just like, it's not your fault. Chibnall bad, and then he goes in the cryo chamber.
Yeah. Sure, you could maybe make the case that even if she hadn't done it, they would have found a way, but like, you still gave them an easy in.
Yeah. I don't know. Other flaws. Here's the thing: like, the flaws of this episode aren't bad. It's just, which is like,
it's
a
just
shocking contrast.
It's mid.
Yeah,
and it's like it's and they're not. Admittedly, they're not all going to be Human Natures or Silence in the Libraries or Impossible Planet Satan Pits, but it's like, I do kind of miss that mid-season like banger two-parter. Because, like, I feel like you don't get it in Moffat era until, like, maybe, like, well, I think Series 9 is kind of all somewhat banger two-parters, because that's
banger two-parter the series.
Yeah. I can't... Does Season 8 have a two... No, it has the end two-parter. I don't think it has a mid-season two-parter.
No. But
yeah, no, it's just because that format allows like you to do so much more, and it feels like it's a slot that's been wasted, partly because people haven't wanted to write them, and then partly because of the run order getting cut.
Yeah.
But it's just like, man, I miss those, because those back in the RTD era, those were like almost always like major standouts.
Yeah, this feels very, like, in comparison to, like, the banger two-parter RTD stuff, this feels very classic Trek in the sense that, like, the concept is good, the setting in it is interesting, the side characters are there, it's all paced
Trad
well.
versus rad, if you will.
This really does feel like a TNG era Star Trek episode, or like a TNG Star Trek episode, I'd say, where it's like, I could totally imagine this as like some Federation ship being called in to negotiate a settlement between like two species that share a planet. I'm pretty sure there are plot lines that exist like that in Star Trek.
Multiple.
Yeah.
It's a Trek trope. But yeah, basically the point being there is that, like, in Legacy Trek and Classic Trek as well, there's a lot of, like, there's more emphasis on the plot, the narrative, and the theme rather than, like, consistent character and, like, making it really resonant. So while the side characters are serviceable and the three leads act their asses off, it's not anything like...
Yeah, definitely.
It's not Human Nature.
Yeah, no, and it's the idea of, like, rad versus trad, and this is very much kind of trad Doctor Who, whereas the RTD, like, banger two-parters, if you think about it, you have Empty Child, and you have Impossible Planet Satan Pit, and you have Human Nature, and you have Silence in the Library, and, like, all of those, well, maybe to differing lengths, like, obviously, like, Human Nature is a lot more rad than trad, but it's like, those RTD two-parters tended to do weirder things and take advantage of that time slot, and it's just, I miss those. I really do. Especially because I feel like one of the problems with Doctor Who as a whole recently has been it hasn't felt as rad recently. Aside from, like, the banger episodes like Demons of the Punjab is really, like, the one that's... And it takes you away, are, like, the two that really stick out. And then everything else has just kind of been Doctor Who by numbers. And it's like, this show's been around for so long at this point. Like, we can't keep doing this.
No.
Because, like, you can tell week after week, like, we started with the RTD stuff, and we had more to say every week because it was the first time we'd really been doing stuff. But we've gotten to where we are now, and it's just like, we can't keep doing this over and over again, because as we are literally seeing us, like... have less and less to talk about, because, like, what is there to say that's new?
Yeah, and as I said, like and
you need to mix shit up more.
Yeah, I meant what I said when I said, like, if Chibnall era was more like this, then I really wouldn't have, like, I'd probably still have problems, but they wouldn't be the problems that we have.
It would just be, it's fine, as opposed to, oh my god, it is painfully bland.
Yeah. So, like, Series 11, I felt, tried to be more, like, new trad, in that it was just, like, we're gonna have, like, new monsters, there's not gonna be, like, reoccurring stuff, and then they immediately broke that with the Daleks, and then this tried to be, like, the greatest hits of, like, Series 12 tried to be the greatest hits of, Radhu, with,
Not even, because everything else was pretty normal Doctor Who, except for maybe Can You Hear Me, but that didn't really work out as well, and was a bad fit for its time slot. And then really the only thing was the finale, which feels like, oh, you guys were complaining about last year's finale sucking shit, so here, have, like, a bastard cobbled together shit child of a Moffat and RTD finale.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just kind of sad. It's like the show, I can see the show grappling with its own identity, and maybe, again, that's, like, putting too much responsibility away from Chris Chibnall, but, like, I can at least somewhat understand if you were just like, how the hell am I gonna follow Moffat? Well, I guess I'll return to basics, but, like, even that really hasn't been done, and it's just kind of been, like, all up in the air. And again, it would just be like, if he stuck to his guns and did stuff like 42 and the Hungry Earth Cold Blood two-parter, I could at least respect that. I would say that's a consistent tone and, you know, pace for the show. But I really don't have any idea what the fuck is going on, and not in the cool WandaVision
not
way.
In the cool not in the cool Final Fantasy VII remake way, where it's like, oh my god, they're completely off the chain. Fucking anything could happen next. Like, fucking Sephiroth could be like, Cloud, I need you and Aerith to join me so we can defeat the real villain, Gact. Like, it's not that fun, or like the Metal Gear fun, entertaining way. It's just like, it seems like even the show doesn't know what it wants to be.
Yeah, if there's two things we've learned by diving into this era already, it is that 11 should not be as horny as he later becomes, and that Chris Chibnall is not Nomura.
Yeah.
Those are the two things we've learned.
Nobody's Nomura other than Nomura.
Exactly.
I almost feel like season 5 has this, and honestly all of 11's run has this weird tonal dissonance, like where you have these remnants of, like, RTD era writing and tone, but also all these Moffat flares, and it just sort of clashes a lot of the time and doesn't always stick the landing, and it feels kind of like it jumps around in tone a lot between episodes and even within episodes, like we see with this story.
But even then, like, I feel like it kind of still works, and I mean, like, that's not even like, I think it's a good transition, because, like, as we know, when Moffat goes, like, full into his bullshit, it gets, like, kind of downhill. Like, let's just compare this to, like, next season's mid-series two-parter that's not, like, arc-related. Well, it is sort of arc-related, but not, like, big arc-related, which would be Hungry Earth, Cold Blood. I mean, not Hungry Earth, Cold Blood. Rebel Flesh, Almost People, which starts off really promising and then just nosedives through the second episode, and it's just like, man.
Yeah, it feels like, I don't know, at least to me, despite the complaints I've been having about, like, some of this episode, and even, God, the Dalek episode, and the episode with James Corden, like, despite all that bullshit, like, at least
it's
that
a very
feels...
solid season, yeah.
Yeah, it feels consistent. It feels like it knows where it wants to go. It isn't a home fucking run like Series 1, but it's like,
or,
you know...
4, or even necessarily... actually, it might be on about Series 3's level.
Yeah, it's like, you know, there's a consistent arc, and when everything is falling through, like, it wraps up, like, pretty nicely. And I can at least buy that and, like, see how that works when I think about how Moffat had a treatment for Series 5 that involved Tennant. I can see where some of the Moffatisms might come in and how that might influence how he'd do that before, like, changing it for a new Doctor. But then, like, once he had to, like, invent his own bullshit, like, completely from scratch, plus Sherlock.
Yeah,
know,
definitely.
I can see where that goes under before coming out again with the era of Peter Capaldi. Bless that based man.
Yeah.
We've gone on a lot of tangents, but it goes to show that like this really isn't this two-parter really isn't an interesting microcosm for like the entire history of the reboot era of Who in a weird way.
Yeah. It's weird. Yeah. So I guess before we wrap it up, it is important to talk about how we have Rory Death #2.
Take a drink.
This one actually kind of sticks here. And yeah, and you also get the scene where he pulls the shrapnel out from the crack and sees it's like a charred piece of the TARDIS sign. And it's like that, building up for the finale thing. Although it is kind of shitty about how there is something that's like that bugged me about it this time around, where he's like, just leave him, like we don't have time. And it's like, bitch, that crack was grabbing him pretty slowly. You could have picked up his corpse and moved it into the TARDIS. Come on.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that.
Yeah,
that
this is a real him letting down Amy moment. It also just feels weird.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, all the crack things, they don't really feel. Besides the angels, that's the one where it was really well integrated.
Yeah,
but like this one just felt like tacked on.
Yeah,
it felt like
almost feels like he's trying to see what happens, because he's like, Amy, you have to remember. It's almost as if he's taking that opportunity to test and see if someone can break it. Which is weirdly out of character for 11.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say. Wow. That rarely happens. Just completely... Oh. I was gonna say the last scene is really... it brilliantly acted. Karen Gillan, huge props to her. Catch her in Thor 4, it looks like. Anyways, I remember. I would not be surprised if Amy had somehow remembered Rory disappearing, or if Rory had just died and, like, didn't disappear. Her, like, faith and, like, idolization kind of 11 probably would have, like, broken flat out right there.
Yeah.
Again, you could argue that's also true of Amy's choice, but clearly with the hindsight, it's like, yeah, that wasn't really like, it isn't the same thing. So it's just interesting to see like how different things get in the way of her realizing that like this isn't the powerful like fairy tale Raggedy Man that's come back to like give her the awesome life that she missed out on. It's interesting how many things it takes for her to finally get to that point where 11 has to basically spell it out for her.
And literally say, hey, asshole.
Yeah. Where he has to tell her flat out in the episode whose name I always forget that's in the Hotel of Doom. But yeah. There's some interesting stuff there. And again... Who the fuck knows how much of that was Chibnall and how much of that was Moffat. That last scene probably was Moffat, but
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, I guess unless anybody else has anything to say, moving on to ratings. Yeah. It's pretty mid. It's way better than most of what Chibnall was going to put out. I wouldn't get grumpy if you put this episode on as opposed to something else. I'd just be kind of like, I mean, if you're picking this one, I mean, okay. Yeah, it's fine, fucking solid B tier. But that's fine, you need to have B tier episodes in the season every now and then. It's just when your entire season is batting B at best,
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, this is a very solid episode. It's definitely not one of the all-time two-part bangers in the revival, but that's fine. It manages to have its own story while also progressing the arc of the series, which is pretty much something every episode of this series has done successfully to one extent or another. The side characters are good. It's well paced. Narratively and thematically, it's pretty cogent and like a good story. It feels very Legacy Trek in how it's like a very basic, not badly told, but like cliche scenario, but giving it new life, which is awesome. You need stuff like that. I would argue in like any medium, in any format, in any show, whatever. But yeah, it's a strange microcosm of the history of New Who in a way, which is mostly what we talked about. But as I said, very solid episode. I'd probably give it it's in B tier definitely, probably a B plus. Just given the fact of what Matt Smith, Karen Gillan, and Arthur Darvill are able to bring to like insert their characters and insert their personality into an episode that like really doesn't highlight them except for like the third act. That's pretty impressive, honestly. So yeah, B plus, and Silurians are hot. Come for me.
All right, Virgil.
Yeah, the episode is like, it's really tonally weird and very, it just has a weird tonal mix. I think the characters were all like pretty decent. I think, I'm obviously never gonna not enjoy seeing a white woman fuck everything up because like, and I think the other characters were like pretty good, and I think Amy and Rory did well in this episode. I do think the bit with the crack felt a little tacked on. Like they needed to have a scene in there with the crack, and they didn't exactly know what to do with it. And it does set up a later arc, but with the rest of the episode, it didn't feel too consistent with the rest of it. It just sort of happens at the end. Unlike with the Angels episode where it's sort of tied to the plot, where I think it's better there. I think in general Moffat tries a little too hard to make the crack show up in every episode in this season. Like compare that to something like Bad Wolf, where it's sort of embedded throughout, but it's not really like, oh look, there's a big spooky crack, we're gonna devote 5 minutes of the episode to this instead of giving it to the plot. That's not a problem here because it's a two-parter, but I think it can be a problem in some of the other episodes. Overall, I think it's fine. It's Chibnall. It's Chibnall. It's like a 6.75.
Yeah, that's fair. Next week, I'm very excited about next week because next week we get to talk about one of the all-time great banger episodes, Vincent and the Doctor. Which I'm very excited to do. Until then, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at B2TARDISPod. You can also support us on Patreon for a number of benefits, such as early access to episodes, the ability to listen in to the recording of an episode, and potentially even the ability to guest star on an episode of your choosing. I'm Geoff. You can follow me on Twitter at WheatleyDL.
I'm Charlotte Clymer. I'm a white woman that fucks things up on Twitter. You can follow me at skyhigh9_5 for all those mediocre shit posting takes.
I'm Virgil, and you can follow me at NessQuixotic along with all the other homies.
And we will see you all next week.